It's going to be like a MBA course or something with five, basically not students, because you may know more than me about this, but certainly opinionated students, I'm sure about that. And as you see, I'm actually going to talk about something slightly different that was announced, because this was actually the topic that was chosen. And it's going to be about the sectoral impact of the trade war, with a little bit of tech in there, as supposedly would be interesting for you. So this is all what I'm going to cover. You might be especially interested in Hong Kong, since we're based here. And it's really all about which sectors, which countries will either benefit or suffer from the trade war. And I hope you can make this useful for your investment decisions at this conference. So first of all, I just want to mention that if you think data so far has been poor, wait for the next couple of months, because here in this line there, where you see intensity of global news on trade war, what I'm trying to measure there, this is big data exercise we conduct quite frequently on many topics actually, and this is specifically how the world perceives the trade war. And as you can tell there, it was kind of not in the news for a while because they were negotiating, or at least not as much in the news, but we're back to really intense discussions, as you all know. And there you see the best measure that you probably all know we can find, at least with very timely data about trade flows. So value of trade globally, which is the Baltic Dry Index. And that shows you that it's been recovering actually, and this is probably a consequence of the negotiations, but it's going to fall again sharply. So no matter how bad it has looked so far, if you look at PMI, Chinese PMI, and so on, it's going to get worse, because we will see the impact of the standoff of the negotiations very soon. It's not yet in the data you've seen. That's first message I want to convey. This is all of the measures. So of course the presentation is available for anybody who wants to see it. So whatever is too small, I won't spend a minute because you can't read it. But if you want to have an account of all of the crazy things that not only the US administration, but frankly also the Chinese one, because we have there a column called retaliation from China. So both sides, all of the crazy measures that we've seen introduced in the last few months, they're all there. There are many, and they're relevant. But of course, what is more relevant is to actually look in detail as to what has been targeted, which products have been targeted. And there, what we do is to classify all of those products. Believe it or not, we actually were asked by the NDRC to send this data, which I thought, wow, I was very, very, very proud of my analyst long time ago, basically classifying all of these products into intermediate, final, and as well as low-end, high-end, following basically UN classification of products, so Comtrade basically. And if you look at that, the story is as follows: the 50 billion, the products chosen by the US administration in the first batch of import tariffs were, let me see if I can help you read this here, mainly high-end. And some of you may have already heard me saying this, but some of them were not even exported from China into the US, such as military equipment, as you can imagine, and airspace, and aircraft and airspace. So, of course, they weren't targeting a trade deficit. This was announced, a long time ago. It's like more than a year ago. And thus, I wonder what the world has been thinking, because from the beginning, the US was telling the world, I don't care about the trade deficit. I'm trying to target China. Whatever I say, everybody knows by now. But I'm saying you just had to look at the list to figure it out, that the US was targeting what China wanted to become, not what China was already. Or it may be, because China does export, of course, military and airspace and aircraft, but not to the US. So not at the end of the value chain. Second part, I'm going to focus only on the US because I have a lot to show you. This one, though, the one that we have just seen implemented, the 200 billion that were being negotiated at least to the full extent of 25% import tariffs, is very different. It's like, what happened to them? I thought they had a strategy. Well, they have a different strategy here. It's really all low end, no high-end tech, and intermediate goods. Most of it is 200 billion targeted. What is it? Very clearly, and I guess we've understood it by now, but again, this was announced a while ago in the summer. I remember I was roadshowing in the US, and everybody was looking at this data. It was all about decoupling, moving the value chain out of China. What they were trying to do is, whatever comes directly from China to me, low end, of course, ICT, etc. Most of it is actually parts and components. Low end. I don't want it from China, I want it from somewhere else, be it Mexico, a lot has been rerouted, Vietnam, just not from China. So this is the story, and I think it's very clear that whoever thought there was no plan just had to look at the list and classify these items. So this is the first thing, first message. Now, is this relevant for China, and where? So we just look at the proportion of overseas revenue in China's 3,000 listed companies. So we just go through the financial statements, and we find that Chinese companies, yes, of course, the domestic market is huge, no doubt about it, but their dependence on overseas market is increasingly relevant. First message. Second message is, of course, very different across sectors. Which are the sectors most dependent on overseas markets? Guess. ICT, CTE, Huawei, especially Huawei. And then consumer durables, Haier, all of these companies. These are the big losers of these tariffs because they're so exposed. Of course, I don't have data. It's very hard to find. I'm telling you that I've tried very hard to find data as to how dependent they are on the US in particular. So, this could distort. So maybe, say, Huawei, much more dependent perhaps on other markets, obviously, not perhaps, surely. So it might distort the impact when you look at that. But I'm just saying, it's important to realize that the sectoral impact in China is very, very different. What about Hong Kong? Not the right day to talk about this, but let's be bold and talk about it. No politics there, just data. Okay, so Hong Kong is really, and this is this note that I've never written a note which received such nasty comments, I must say. It was called Hong Kong's butterfly effect. Some positive ones from some, nice people, but most of them were, why do I talk about Hong Kong as an independent, well, first of all, this is a trade note. Hong Kong is, a member of the WTO on its own right. So of course I can write about trade and Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be actually one of the most important trade platforms in the world. So anyway, point is, I got very negative comments because the note claims that Hong Kong today is a springboard for the mainland, both in terms of trade and especially outward investment, let alone the use of its financial market. Meaning, if you look at bond issuance in Hong Kong, this is just simply amazing. In 2013, not long ago, these were the issuance by Chinese companies in Hong Kong, non-existent. To today, 80%. We've gone a long way. Meaning there's many more issuance from Chinese. Nothing wrong with it, I'm saying. This market is more of a market in terms of attracting capital for Chinese companies than for foreign companies. And this is true for IPOs and, So that's one message. The other one is that Hong Kong, trade-wise, if you look at Hong Kong data, during the whole trade war situation, its exports to the US ballooned, as you can imagine. So it was used as a springboard to export into the US with of course, no import tariffs. Yeah? So that's another springboard idea. The other one, which is even trickier, and that might interest some of you in the tech world, is that Hong Kong has, under its Hong Kong Policy Act, not a preferential treatment, but a better treatment than China for export licenses. Some of you may know this. Meaning it's, of course, much easier to import sensitive technology into Hong Kong than into the mainland. So guess what? This is the approval rate. Here, you see this? This is a much lower approval. I have a graph in the report for whoever's interested, which looks at how much the approval rate has come down since the trade war started. So what I'm trying to say is that Hong Kong is being observed, meaning that a lot of this sensitive technology, which used to be very easy to import through Hong Kong, no longer is, because the rate of approval by the US is much lower. So all of this doesn't bode well for the role, for that new role, or increasingly important role for Hong Kong, which is basically springboard for the mainland. If you look at even the reform of CFIUS, if somebody follows that, before basically buying a US company from Hong Kong was so much easier than today. And this is something we need to realize. So I won't get any further on Hong Kong, but I just wanted to basically summarize everything I said by the trade war is terrible for Hong Kong. For reasons that are unrelated to trade necessarily, but that basically are based on the fact that Hong Kong increasingly became a springboard for the mainland. And thus, Hong Kong is targeted. Not directly today. I got this question twice this morning. Will Hong Kong be treated as China? Either by revoking the Hong Kong Policy Act, which I doubt will happen, but most importantly, simply by introducing Hong Kong as one more country in the import tariffs from the US. Everybody's asking this question now. I'm not relating it to the events. I'm just saying, forget about the events. I wrote this report 9 months ago. It's all about Hong Kong's role in this story. And that's, I think, a relevant message for anybody who works in Hong Kong. Now, I'm going to be briefer here, and again, it's a lot of data. We're going to publish a report late July on all of this and much more. It's a report called China Corporate Monitor, Asia Corporate Monitor. What we do there is to look at the health of corporates in Asia. But there is a specific chapter which looks at the impact of the trade war in North Asia, so North meaning Taiwan, Korea, Japan, all of these countries that are in the midst of the value chain, especially semiconductors. I forgot Taiwan, Korea, Japan, I'm missing Singapore, I'm missing one, and China, of course. This is the China separately, and then the others in one report. So we've worked with the data, and what we are trying to say here, I'll be very brief, is that these countries are at the core of the trade war, not because I claim it, it's because when you look sector by sector as to where the tariffs have been imposed with the exercise I mentioned before, you find that basically they are the bulk of the manufacturing on those sectors, and of course the exports of those sectors that are targeted. So, and because of the value chain, even if they're not directly targeted by the US, they are indirectly targeted by the US. So here is, for example, telecommunication equipment. So here what you see is how much of global telecommunication equipment is exported or imported from all these countries. So you see China standing out. Semiconductors, imports. Autos, Japan exports, China importing, and to some extent exporting. So we're trying to look at who is more relevant in these sectors for the main products targeted in the trade war, so that you get a sense of dimension. And here we look at something very important. Why are these countries, all of them? And if you follow the data, exports from Korea, they're just plummeting, okay? As as you would imagine, you know, the first idea you could argue is, oh, they will benefit because they can substitute the US into China, imagine, yeah? I mean, rather than buying, I don't know, semiconductors from the US into China because they may be targeted with tariffs, although semiconductors not so much from China's side because they desperately need them. Korea could export to China rather than US into China. So that substitution effect. But actually, the problem is that it's so integrated. I'll show you in a minute a few graphs about Samsung and Apple. And on top of that, these countries, basically their bilateral relations is all manufacturing and all in the sectors that are targeted. There's nothing else they export among each other. So the impact is massive. And that's why you see this minus 20, minus 30% in collapse in exports, because that's all they do among each other. And that's very, very worrying for the region. So I did mention that I would show you a little bit of a sense of, you know, how related these big countries are to either China or the US. So say Korea. In Korea, you basically, and again, this is only part of the story. That's really what they publish in their financial statement. So who are the suppliers in percentage? Who are the clients in percentage? And you don't have the ultimate final client. So China could be very important there. It's just that these are their corporate clients. So this is in the value chain. So you see, for example, how dependent Samsung is from the US from the supplier side, let alone from the client side. So I think this is interesting to realize what could be the ultimate interest of a company. Of course, you need to add final consumption, final consumer to assess. But what I'm saying is the US is very present in this value chain. I mean, let's face it. It's not that, okay, because you are in Asia, your decisions are very clear geographically. This is not the way it works. Probably Samsung would not be able to have, you know, final exports into, say, China without those suppliers. So they're trapped. And this is why you see that terrible data, not only in terms of exports, but investment, sentiment, because they're trapped. But even Apple is trapped, because look at the suppliers. One could wonder, well, maybe could be perhaps re-offshore somewhere else. But as I'm going to point out in a minute, that's very difficult in the short run. So I think this gives you a sense of, you know, how interrelated, how integrated, why basically you see such poor data from Korea, from Japan, from Singapore. It couldn't be otherwise. That's all they do. I mean, the sector that is targeted, or the sectors that are targeted. So, because you may say, okay, this lady came here, I was having great fun, everything she says is negative, please stop. So I'm going to move to some slightly more positive news, which is the medium term. As everything on Earth, we can always change things. You know, we just need time. And I'm going to allow for some time and develop a story of where this value chain could move around. Not that I have, you know, how would I say, it's hard to tell because lots of things have to happen. I'm here just arguing, well, if the infra were there, if blah, 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 which would be the countries within Asia? So first thing to note is that nobody can become China. I would say nobody can become China in terms of reshoring or re-nearshoring or whatever of the production tomorrow. Why? Because China's share of manufacturing is 30% of global manufacturing. It's impossible. No country can do that. The only country that could potentially do that in terms of labor force is India, and unfortunately, India is nowhere to be found with, you know, like 2% of global manufacturing share, which is basically for themselves, and it doesn't really, it's not even enough, as you know. They have a current account deficit, certainly on the manufacturing sector. So forget it. Nobody has the capacity to take that. Now, these points here, this crazy RCA, which I should explain, is what we call relative comparative advantage. You can tell I'm an economist. Only economists write things that nobody understands, and they keep on talking about them. But it basically means how close is that specific country to China's comparative advantage. How close they are, let alone their size. I'm just only talking cost-wise, economic structure-wise, to replicate what China does on the manufacturing sector. And that is Vietnam. You see it here, even better. Why? Because Vietnam costs are lower, labor costs, and the logistics, it might not be as good as China, but we have all of the calculations there. They're closer than any other country in ASEAN, let alone India. So that's why we think that Vietnam's share will increase. Can Vietnam become China? Of course not. So the new value chain is not going to look like this one, where you may have two suppliers, both in China. It's over. That's not going to happen. Nobody is going to dare do that again. First, because you can't. Only India could do that, and it's going to take ages. And still, you'd say, why repeat the same mistake? Why depend on a single country? So you may go to Vietnam, to India, so it's going to become even more complex. People argue that the value chains are going to disappear. I actually think they're going to become more complex. And they're going to become more regional. And this is already happening. So I think it's important to understand that it's no longer enough to have one supplier or one country of origin as supplier or even client. And here you have more or less the story to then show you, well, this is just a sense of where we stand. This is not about the trade war. Actually, these numbers, of course, were there before the trade war. This is monthly wages. So China basically ballooned, massively increased its monthly wages, in the manufacturing sector for many years before the trade war. So that process had already started. It's just that because of the trade war, companies that had kind of put up with this increasing costs are there thinking now, we need to take this decision before it's too late. And that's why you see a lot of companies actually moving or leaving part of the production in China for the demand in China and moving the rest elsewhere. So China has no comparative advantage even with a country like Thailand or Malaysia. It's just very expensive, which explains why already today, this is first quarter of 2018, FDI into ASEAN was actually bigger than FDI into China. So what I'm saying is no news. It's just, it had been happening already. It's only going to accelerate. So I would imagine that FDI, if Modi kindly agrees to open up India for business, and especially manufacturing FDI, I can imagine this is going to balloon. And certainly ASEAN. So this is basically the trend that we have to think about. Where will it go? The only thing we've done here is to rank countries by a number of variables that, of course, I can share with you the report, including the quality of the infrastructure, rule of law, blah, 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 countries, in terms of their attractiveness for manufacturing, and that's for FDI from the rest of the world. And you can see that Thailand is the best ranked country for medium tech capital intensive sectors, so autos, for example, while Vietnam is the best ranked for labor intensive sectors, so assembling. So I think this gives you a sense of where the money may be heading. I'm not saying that China will receive no FDI, but it will receive FDI mainly for its own domestic market. So companies will separate. If whatever is China for China will remain, if possible, if the conditions warrant it. I'm now abstracting from the situation between the US and China, as you can imagine, but whatever is for somebody else may move elsewhere. It's simply cheaper, and it's not as risky in terms of not only new tariffs, but other types of constraints from the US-China strategic competition, which is where we are. So in a nutshell, the trade war is spreading in terms of sectors and countries. We should not only look at China, US. I think I've spared you from a part of the presentation which was all about the impact on Europe and Japan, which I've also worked on, because that would have been too much. You would have all fallen asleep by now. But I'm just saying, this is the way to think about this, because there's so many interrelations, both sectoral and country-wise, that we should not forget about. It's not only about US and China. This is very, very important. Not all sectors will be losers, and not all countries will be losers either. So imagine, I do think ICT sector will be hit very hard in China, because as I showed you, it's basically the largest, the sector which is most dependent on overseas revenues. So you may say that the demand in China is huge, yes, but among all of the sectors, that's the one that, in my humble opinion, will be hardest hit. And I'm abstracting from constraints or export constraints from the US or technology constraints, etc. It's just because of how dependent it is on overseas revenues. Hong Kong, clear loser. Sorry to say, if somebody has better ideas, I'm very happy to hear those, because I live here as well. But this is my take on and it is not related to what we are seeing yesterday. It's not about that. It's really about that springboard role that will be put into question by the rest of the world, certainly the US. North Asia, severely, sorry, this is a spelling mistake, severely affected, especially in the semiconductor space. And in the medium term, that's the only good news I had for you today. I think there will be some winners in emerging Asia. I just pinpointed Vietnam and Thailand. There could be others. India, surely, if Modi does go through clear structural reforms in terms of infra and manufacturing, inward FDI into manufacturing, I think it can really be a dream game. But will he do it? I have no idea. I just came back from Delhi last week, and it looks very promising, but you know, he does have to deliver. So that's all I have to say, and very happy to take questions. There is 3 minutes left, it seems. Yeah.
Any questions?
Thank you.